A disoriented man sits alone in a diner at 3 a.m., frantically writing on napkins. Don't believe anything they say. Don't believe anything I say. Before his eyes go glassy, a slow smile spreads across his face, and he calmly crumples the napkins and orders pie, humming to himself. In the trash can, the warnings start to rot beside old coffee grounds.
Welcome to the Haunted Horror Half-Hour horror stories that haunt your mind.
Harmony Falls didn't look wrong at first. That was the problem. Zoe noticed it the second she stepped out of the car. The air clung to her, thick and sweet, like someone had spilled honey and tried to wipe it up with something already rotten. It coated the back of her throat. She swallowed once, then again, like she could force it down. "Smell that?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. Her dad stretched his arms overhead, breathing in deep like they'd just arrived at the beach. "Fresh air," he said. "Way better than the city." Zoe glanced at him. "It smells like something's gone bad." He smiled, but it came just a fraction too late, like he'd heard the line before and needed a second to remember how to react. "You'll get used to it." That was the first moment something in her chest tightened. The house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with identical mailboxes and lawns trimmed too evenly, like they'd been measured instead of cut. A woman from next door was already walking toward them before the engine had even stopped ticking. "Welcome," she called, waving too eagerly. "You must be the new family." Her voice was warm. Her eyes weren't. Zoe watched closely as the woman reached them. There it was again, that pause. The smile came just a beat after the greeting, like it had to catch up. "I'm Mrs. Delaney," she said, shaking Zoe's mother's hand. "We're so happy you're here. Everyone is just wonderful in Harmony Falls." Wonderful. The word hung there, too polished, too practiced. Zoe shifted her weight. The sweetness in the air seemed stronger now, almost pulsing. "Isn't it just the friendliest place?" Mrs. Delaney added. Her dad laughed. "Already feels like it." Zoe met the woman's gaze. For a split second, the smile dropped. Not completely, just enough to show something underneath. Something tired, something watchful. Then it snapped back into place. "Yes," Mrs. Delaney said, softer now. "It really is." Behind her, another neighbor stood at the edge of their yard, staring. When Zoe noticed him, he lifted his hand in a slow wave, half a second late. Zoe waved back automatically, her skin prickling. Every movement here felt delayed, like the town was slightly out of sync with itself. As they carried boxes inside, Zoe glanced down the street again. Every house looked perfect, every lawn untouched, every window reflecting the same dull, gray sky, and every person watching them wore that same warm, careful expression. Smiles just a little too slow, eyes that never quite joined in. Her dad's voice echoed from inside. "Zoe, come on, you'll love it here." She lingered on the porch, breathing in that sickly sweetness, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she had a clear, steady thought. Something in this town was pretending, and it wasn't very good at it. By Wednesday morning, Zoe had started keeping track of the lies. Not because she wanted to, because once she noticed the first one, she couldn't stop noticing them. Rain hammered the school windows in thick gray sheets as her first period history teacher adjusted his glasses and smiled at the class. "Beautiful weather today," Mr. Harlan said. A few students nodded automatically. Zoe stared at him. Water streamed down the glass behind his head hard enough to blur the parking lot into watercolor smears. Mr. Harlan followed her gaze toward the storm outside. Then, without missing a beat, he added, "Not a drop out there." A couple kids laughed softly, but not like it was a joke. More like relief. Zoe waited for someone to say something. Nobody did. Mr. Harlan resumed the lesson as if nothing strange had happened. 5 minutes later, the rain stopped. Not gradually. 1 second it roared against the building. The next, silence. The windows were dry. Zoe felt cold spread slowly through her stomach. By lunch, she'd counted 17 lies. Tiny ones. Meaningless ones. A boy told his friend he hated pizza while eating 3 slices. A girl said she was allergic to sunlight while standing in it. Another student casually mentioned she'd broken her arm last year, even though both arms were clearly fine. The lies came constantly, woven into conversations so naturally nobody reacted anymore. Except Zoe. "You're new, right?" The voice startled her. A girl sat across from her in the cafeteria, blonde hair tied neatly back, expression friendly in the same careful way everyone here seemed friendly. "I'm Cassidy," she said. "My sister usually sits here, but she's homesick today." Zoe glanced around. "Your sister goes here too?" Cassidy nodded. "Twin sister." Something about the answer bothered Zoe immediately. Maybe because nobody at school looked remotely related to Cassidy. Maybe because there was only one name listed under Cassidy Reed on the attendance sheet in homeroom. Or maybe because Cassidy's smile arrived just a little too late. "Oh," Zoe said carefully. "What's her name?" Cassidy opened her mouth and froze. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Zoe saw it. A flicker of panic behind the eyes. "Claire," Cassidy said finally. The name sounded chosen. Not remembered. Before Zoe could respond, a janitor pushed a mop bucket past their table. Old. Thin. Nervous. "The gym's upstairs today," he muttered to nobody. The gym was downstairs. "The principal died last winter." He hadn't. "My wife hates tulips." His wedding ring glinted as his hands shook violently on the mop handle. Every sentence was a lie. Every single one. And between each one, there was a tiny pause where his face went pale with absolute terror. As he passed Zoe's table, he stopped moving. For one brief second, he said nothing at all. His breathing hitched. His eyes locked onto hers, and Zoe saw something raw and pleading buried underneath the fear. Then his expression snapped back into place. "You've been here your whole life," he whispered to her. He hurried away before she could answer. The cafeteria doors opened behind him. A girl walked inside carrying a lunch tray. Blonde hair, friendly smile, Cassidy's exact face. Her twin sister waved at the table. Half a second too late. The Harmony Falls Public Library smelled like old paper and something underneath it. Something organic, faintly sweet. Zoe pushed through the heavy front door after school, the warmth inside landing against her face like a held breath finally released. The building was small. One main room, wooden shelves packed tight, a circulation desk nobody was sitting at. She almost missed the librarian entirely. The woman sat motionless in the corner, thin as a folded letter, watching Zoe over the rim of her glasses. "We close at 4, she said. It was 3:47. "I just need the local history section," Zoe said. The woman smiled, half a second late. "Of course you do." The founding records were stored in a cardboard box that someone had labeled Harmony Falls, Miscellaneous, in handwriting that pressed too hard into the cardboard, like the person writing it had been angry or afraid. Most of the documents were water damaged. Some were partially burned, edges curling brown and brittle. But the survey map was intact. Zoe flattened it carefully against the table. The land borders were standard: township measurements, acreage, creek lines, except for one notation handwritten on the margin in cramped, urgent letters. Surveyor's note, eastern parcel, a place where no false word may stand. Do not build here. Below it, someone else had written, in different ink, too late. Zoe's throat tightened. She kept digging. Near the bottom of the box, she found a transcript from a town council meeting dated September 1887. The pages were stiff, the ink faded to rust. She read it carefully. It described a problem. The truth ground beneath the eastern parcel, the original settlement site, was making life impossible. Every secret surfaced. Every lie dissolved instantly. Marriages were failing. Men were confessing crimes. Children were repeating things that should never have been spoken aloud. The council had voted unanimously to seek an alternative arrangement. The transcript ended mid-sentence. And so the arrangement was made, and the mouth was satisfied, and we agree to feed it as it requires, and never to... The rest of the page was burned away cleanly, like someone had held a match to it on purpose. Behind her, a book slid off a shelf. Zoe turned. The librarian stood 6 feet away, closer than she should have been, smiling that slow, careful smile. I used to teach school, you know, she said pleasantly. A lie. This library has never had any historical records. Another. Her eyes hadn't moved from Zoe's hands since she walked in. You're not going to find anything interesting here. Zoe looked down at the burned transcript still open on the table between them, then backed up. I already did, she said. The librarian's smile stayed perfectly in place. But her hands, folded neatly at her waist, gripped each other white-knuckle tight. The honey rot smell was thickest on the north edge of town, where the pavement ended and the woods began. Zoe stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring at the row of 7 houses. They were breathtakingly maintained: fresh white paint, window boxes overflowing with vibrant marigolds, and grass that looked like it had been manicured with scissors. But as Zoe stepped closer, the silence hit her like a physical weight. In the rest of Harmony Falls, the air was a chaotic symphony of pleasantries and practiced deceptions. Here, there was nothing. No wind chimes, no distant television hum, no barking dogs. Even the insects seemed to avoid the flower beds. Don't look at them. Zoe jumped, spinning around. Leo, a boy from her chemistry class who usually spent his time trying to blend into the lockers, stood 10 feet back. His face was a mask of sickly pallor, his pupils blown wide. What's wrong with them? Zoe whispered, nodding toward the silent houses. They're so... still. They ran out, Leo hissed. He didn't move any closer, his boots rooted to the edge of the shadows cast by a nearby oak. The families. They used up all their words. Every small lie. Every fake good morning. Every I'm fine. They spent it all. And when you run out of things to say that aren't true, you stop existing out here. That doesn't make sense, Zoe began. But Leo had already turned, sprinting back toward the center of town without a backward glance. That night, the silence of the north edge followed Zoe home. She lay in bed, watching the shadows of tree branches crawl across her ceiling. The house felt tight, like it was bracing for a blow. When her bedroom door creaked open, she nearly bolted out of her skin. Her mother stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hall light. She looked tired, more than tired. She looked translucent, her skin pulling taut over her cheekbones. "Just checking on you, honey," her mother said. She walked to the bedside and smoothed Zoe's hair. Her touch was ice cold. For a long moment, she just stared at Zoe, her lips trembling as if fighting against a heavy, invisible hand. "I love you," her mother whispered. Zoe waited. She waited for the follow-up lie, the "you're safe here," or the "everything is going to be okay." But her mother said nothing else. She simply turned and walked out, closing the door with a click that sounded like a coffin ceiling. Zoe lay paralyzed in the dark. In Harmony Falls, the only thing more terrifying than a lie was the sudden, starving weight of the truth. Zoe found Mara's house by accident, or at least that's what it felt like. It sat just outside of the worst of the sweetness, tucked behind a line of overgrown hedges that hadn't been trimmed into submission like the rest of Harmony Falls. The air here still smelled wrong, but thinner, like whatever coated the town hadn't settled as deeply. Zoe hesitated at the gate, then knocked. "Come in," a voice called immediately. No delay. Zoe froze. She pushed the door open slowly. The woman inside looked ordinary. Mid-60s, soft gray hair pulled into a loose knot, a cardigan draped over her shoulders. She sat at a small kitchen table with 2 cups already poured. "I was wondering when you'd come," Mara said. No pause, no hitch. The smile that followed arrived exactly when it should. Zoe stepped inside carefully. "You're the first person here who doesn't feel off." Mara let out a quiet breath, almost like a laugh. "That's because I don't lie." The words landed heavily between them. Zoe sat. The tea was weak, almost colorless. It smelled faintly bitter, cutting clean through the honey-sweet air. "I read something," Zoe said, "in the library, about an arrangement." Mara nodded once, like she'd been waiting for that too. "They settled on cursed land," she said. "Truth ground. Every lie spoken there failed. Every secret surfaced. Imagine living like that. Not just honesty, but exposure. Constant, involuntary confession." Zoe thought of the transcript, the burned edges. "So they, what, fixed it?" "They invited something in," Mara said simply. The room felt smaller. "Something old. Something that could swallow the truth before it reached the surface." Zoe's throat tightened. "And all they had to do was lie?" Mara shook her head. "Not quite. It doesn't feed on the lies themselves. It feeds on the choice." She leaned forward slightly. "Every time someone knows the truth and chooses to say something else, that's what it takes." Zoe's fingers curled around the teacup. "That's why it's constant," Mara continued. "Small lies, meaningless ones. The easier they are to say, the more often people choose them. And as long as those choices keep happening, it stays asleep?" Zoe finished. Mara nodded. The house creaked softly, like it was settling, or listening. Zoe let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since arriving, something made sense. It was horrible, but it was simple, manageable. "So people just keep lying?" Zoe said. "Forever?" "Yes. And nothing happens?" Mara smiled, steady and calm. "Nothing worse than what you've already seen." Zoe sat back in her chair. Outside, somewhere far off, someone laughed, a bright, hollow sound that carried just a little too long. She took a sip of the bitter tea and let the explanation settle into place. A system, a rule, a way to survive. For the first time since Tuesday, the tightness in her chest loosened. If there were rules, then there were ways to follow them. If there were ways to follow them, then maybe Harmony Falls wasn't as helpless as it felt. Maybe it was just hungry. And hunger, Zoe thought, could be managed, as long as you kept feeding it. Mara refilled Zoe's tea without asking. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, thin and shrill enough to make Zoe's shoulders tense. Outside the kitchen window, Harmony Falls sat under a blanket of gray evening light, the streets almost unnaturally calm. Too calm. "You're taking this better than most people do," Mara said. Zoe wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "I think I'm just glad there's an explanation." Mara nodded slowly. "People can survive terrible things if they understand the rules." The honey-sweet smell drifted faintly through the cracked window above the sink. Zoe noticed it seemed stronger now than when she'd arrived. Not everywhere, just around the floorboards. "You really haven't lied?" Zoe asked quietly. "Not in 11 years. The answer came instantly. No pause, no delay. Zoe studied her carefully. "How?" Mara sat down across from her again, cardigan rustling softly. "At first," she said, "very painfully." The kitchen light buzzed overhead. "I thought if I stopped feeding it, maybe I could starve it." Mara gave a tired smile. "I was younger then, more arrogant." Something creaked beneath the house. Not the normal settling of old wood. This sounded slower, heavy, like pressure shifting underground. Zoe glanced downward automatically. Mara noticed. "It hears better at night," she said calmly. Zoe laughed nervously before she could stop herself. "You say things like that way too casually." "I've had time to adjust." Another creak. Longer this time. The tea suddenly tasted wrong in Zoe's mouth. Bitter underneath, but with a faint sweetness she didn't remember before. "You said it stays asleep," Zoe said. Mara's eyes flicked briefly toward the floor. "I said it stays satisfied." A cold pulse moved through Zoe's chest. Outside, a dog barked violently somewhere down the street, then cut off mid-sound. Silence flooded in behind it. Mara stood and crossed to the window. For the first time since Zoe met her, her movements seemed slightly delayed. Not much, just enough. "I was telling the truth earlier," Mara said softly, "about the arrangement." Zoe frowned. "Earlier?" Mara rested one hand against the window pane. "I haven't told a lie in 11 years. Her reflection in the darkening glass smiled a fraction of a second after she did. Zoe stopped breathing. "No," she whispered. Mara turned slowly toward her. Now the delay was obvious. The expression reached her mouth first, then her eyes, then something else underneath it followed. Glassy, borrowed. "I'm so glad you came to visit," Mara said. Her voice sounded thick suddenly, almost layered with another voice beneath it. "I feel so much better now." The floor underneath the kitchen gave a soft, wet knock. Once. Zoe shoved backward from the table so hard her chair slammed onto its side. "Mara!" "She didn't find you," Mara interrupted gently. Another knock from below. Closer. "You were sent to her." The honey smell flooded the kitchen all at once, overpoweringly sweet now, thick enough to taste. And for the first time since arriving in Harmony Falls, Zoe understood something truly horrifying. The town hadn't been teaching her the rules. Something underneath it had. Zoe heard it for the first time at 2 a.m. Not a voice, not a sound she had a word for. Something between breathing and water moving through old pipes. Wet, rhythmic, enormous. Like something the size of a building slowly rolling over in its sleep. It came from the drain in her bathroom floor. She stood in the doorway. barefoot on cold tile, listening to it pulse in the dark. Then it stopped. She told herself it was plumbing. By morning, she knew it wasn't. Mrs. Delaney was standing on her front lawn at 6 a.m., still in her nightgown, speaking to her empty flower beds. "The roses are doing beautifully this year," she was saying. "Just beautiful. Not a single thing wrong." The roses were dead, black stem, collapsed inward like fist. Across the street, a man in a business suit stood at his open front door. Tie knotted perfectly, lying at the empty sidewalk in a flat, urgent voice. "Everything is wonderful. Everything is absolutely fine." Nobody passed to hear it. He didn't seem to notice. 3 blocks down, Zoe counted 7 open doors. 7 people feeding lies to the street like tossing bread to something circling below. The sound under the town had changed. That was what nobody was saying, but everyone knew. It wasn't distant anymore. It wasn't muffled by earth to feel theoretical. Zoe could feel it now through the soles of her shoes. A faint, slow vibration. Patient, rhythmic, like a pulse, like chewing. She found her brother at midnight. She heard him first. A small, steady voice from the backyard, and came downstairs to find him kneeling in the grass in his pajamas, both palms flat against the dirt. He was 6 years old. "There's nobody down there," he was saying softly. "There's nobody down there. There's nobody down there." His eyes were wide open. His voice wasn't scared. That was the worst part. It was practiced, calm, like a prayer he'd already said 1,000 times. "Danny!" Zoe grabbed his shoulders. He looked up at her without surprise. "I have to keep saying it," he whispered. "Why?" He tilted his head, listening to something below the grass that Zoe couldn't hear. "Because it asked me to." The wet, rhythmic sound rose through the ground under her knees, closer than it had ever been, and slower now, like something that had been waiting a very long time had finally decided to stop. The north edge of town felt like a vacuum. Zoe slipped through a side window of the third house in the row, her breath hitching as her feet hit the floorboards. The air inside wasn't just cold, it was sterile, stripped of that suffocating honey sweetness. It was the smell of a tomb. The interior was museum perfect. Every pillow was fluffed, every book aligned by height, yet layers of dust lay over everything like a shroud. Then she saw the walls. They weren't papered, they were covered in paper. Thousands of yellowing sticky notes and taped ledger pages blanketing every square inch of the living room. Zoe stepped closer, her skin crawling. They weren't warnings, they were scripts. "The weather is lovely for a walk. I think I'll make pot roast for dinner tonight. The car started on the first try." Categorized, alphabetized, a desperate library of the mundane. In the kitchen, the dining table was a sea of ink. The handwriting started neat but devolved into a jagged, frantic scrawl toward the end of the table. In the center sat a final, solitary note. "We've said everything untrue we know how to say." Directly beneath the table, a heavy wooden trapdoor stood flung wide. Zoe moved toward the opening, her heart hammering against her ribs. A new scent wafted from the dark. Not honey, not rot, but the ancient metallic tang of wet earth and something sharply predatory. It was the smell of the truth. A heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. Zoe let out a choked scream, spinning around. Her father stood over her. His eyes weren't angry. They were glassy and vacant, reflecting the dim light like marbles. He didn't look like her father anymore. He looked like a man standing behind a mask that no longer fit. In his other hand, he clutched a thick yellow legal pad. "Zoe," he said, his voice flat, rhythmic, and utterly devoid of inflection. "You shouldn't be here. It's almost time for the meeting. He held up the notepad. Pages and pages were filled with his handwriting. Thousands of lines of nonsense. I caught a blue fish. The moon is made of silver. I never loved your mother. I've been preparing, he whispered, a slow, half-second late smile stretching his face until the skin around his eyes crinkled. Just in case we run out. It's important to have a backup, Zoe. It likes variety. Zoe didn't remember leaving the house. One moment, she was standing in that frozen, paper-covered kitchen. The next, she was in the center of town. Everyone was already there. The square was full. Every neighbor, every classmate, every familiar, too-warm face gathered in a perfect circle around the old fountain. No one spoke at first. They just stood, shoulder to shoulder, eyes reflecting in the dim glow of streetlights, waiting. Zoe turned slowly. Her father stood a few feet away, still clutching his yellow notepad. Her mother beside him, pale and still. Even her little brother stood in the crowd, lips moving faintly, practicing. No one acknowledged each other. No one needed to. At exactly the same moment, every head tilted slightly downward, toward the ground. The air thickened. The honey's sweet smell surged, cloying and wet. And then, they began. Nothing is buried here. The voices came together, perfectly synchronized, calm, certain. This town was never built on cursed land. Zoe's stomach dropped. Every word was deliberate, chosen. We have always lived safely. There is nothing beneath us. There has never been anything beneath us. The lie unfolded, growing more elaborate with every sentence. It wasn't frantic like before. This was careful, beautiful, crafted like a story told 1,000 times. Zoe felt it pressing against her ears, against her chest, like the town was trying to convince something, or someone. The earth is empty, they said softly. The ground is silent. There is no mouth. There is nothing to feed. The last word echoed. Feed. And then, silence. Not gradual, total. The smell vanished. The air cleared. For the first time since she arrived, Harmony Falls felt normal. Zoe sucked in a sharp breath. Around her, people sagged with relief. Shoulders dropped. Faces softened. A few even laughed quietly, like they'd just survived something. It worked, someone whispered. It satisfied. Zoe almost believed it. Then, a knock. From below. Deep. Wet. Deliberate. Once. The entire town froze. Zoe's heart stopped. The ground beneath her feet felt thinner, like something on the other side had just leaned closer. And then, everyone started talking again. Too fast. Too loud. It's fine. Everything's fine. Nothing's wrong. We're safe. We've always been safe. There's nothing there. Nothing there. Nothing there. The lies came apart, losing shape, losing meaning. People turned in circles, speaking to no one, to everyone, to the ground itself, feeding it, begging it. Zoe staggered back, covering her ears. It didn't work, she whispered. No, worse. It had, for a second. Understanding hit her like ice water. It wasn't sleeping, she said, her voice shaking. Another slow, shifting pressure rolled beneath the square. It was listening. The lies grew frantic, desperate now. Voices cracking, overlapping, collapsing into noise. And then, without warning, silence. Every mouth kept moving, every face strained, but no sound came out. Not a whisper, not a breath. 30 people, 50, an entire town, screaming lies in perfect absolute silence. Zoe stared, horror crawling up her spine, because beneath her feet, something moved, slow, patient, satisfied, but not full, negotiating. 10 years later, the smell still hit Zoe before anything else. Honey, rot, summer sweetness covering something damp underneath. Harmony Falls looked beautiful in October. The trees burned gold and orange along the sidewalks, lawns trimmed perfectly, windows glowing warm against the early evening dark. Every house looked lived in. Every smile looked practiced. Zoe stood at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes while her daughter colored quietly at the table behind her. "Mom?" Lily asked. "Is it true our town used to be haunted?" Zoe's hands paused in the water. Outside the window, Mrs. Delaney watered flowers across the street. Older now. Slower. Still smiling. Half a second late. Zoe dried her hands carefully before turning around. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Kids at school," Lily shrugged. "They said there's something under Harmony Falls." The words landed softly. Too softly. Like something she'd heard 1,000 times before. Zoe smiled automatically. "There's nothing under this town." The sentence came easily. Too easily. Lily looked unconvinced. "Then why do people talk weird sometimes?" Outside, somewhere down the street, a man laughed too loudly. Another voice answered a little too quickly. Zoe moved to the table and sat across from her daughter. "People just like stories," she said gently. "Harmony Falls is perfectly safe. It's always been perfectly safe." As she spoke, she caught movement in the dark kitchen window behind Lily. Her reflection, smiling. A fraction of a second after she did. Zoe's breath caught. No. For one horrible moment, the room felt unfamiliar, like waking up inside somebody else's dream. She stared at her own reflection, waiting for it to correct itself. It didn't. The delayed smile stayed. Small, careful, practiced. Lily tilted her head. "Mom?" Zoe looked back at her daughter. At some point over the last 10 years, she had stopped noticing the lies around her. The pauses, the delayed expressions, the sweetness in the air. Worse, she couldn't remember when that happened. She thought about leaving sometimes. Didn't she? Her chest tightened. No, not thought about. She remembered packing once. Suitcases by the door. Her father smiling too slowly while helping unpack them again. After that, the memory blurred into softness, into years, into normal. "Mom," Lily whispered, suddenly uneasy now. "Why are you crying?" Zoe touched her face. Tears, cold against her fingertips. "I'm happy," she said automatically. The lie slid out before she even recognized it as one. And somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, something breathed. Slow, enormous, satisfied. The kitchen light flickered once, then steadied. Outside, neighbors waved from across the street with warm, careful smiles. Half a second too late. Zoe smiled back, and this time, she genuinely couldn't tell if she meant it. If you enjoyed this nightmare, subscribe for more. New stories dropping every week. Sleep well, if you can.